Are we all ready? Thank you so much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Juliet Foster, and I'd like to welcome you to the discussion panel, Ensuring Regional Air Connectivity. Now, overwhelming is the word that best describes the power and the influence of the global aviation sector. It supports over 65 million jobs, represents $2.7 trillion in global economic impact, accommodated over 8.2 billion passengers in 2017, and over 118 million metric tons of cargo on more than 95 million flights. I think that the International Air Transport Association, IATA, says it best, and I quote, aviation, plays a unique role in connecting business to markets, uniting family and friends, discovering new cultures and lands, bringing people together to solve problems, as well as building understanding and developing global insights. So connectivity, which lies at the heart of those relationships, is especially important for communities, which, because of their geography, are often cut off from the centres of economic activity. Well, that means the challenge for policymakers is to bring these communities from outside the circle to within, and aviation is important in fulfilling that objective. Why does that matter? Well, strong air links help regions attract investment, maintain population levels, nurture efficient supply chains, create regional business hubs, and generate prosperity. Air connectivity also allows these communities to access essential services like healthcare and education, all of which are vital to their existence and sustainability. In a world where the traditional way of doing things is being upended, and where the public has been vocal in expressing its irritation over the gap between the haves and the have-nots, governments are under pressure to rebalance national economies and move them away from the centre. In that context, aviation is an essential tool in their box, yet making that shift happen is far from easy. Although deregulation has increased aviation services and reduced the price of a ticket, that hasn't been enough to bring connectivity to all regional communities. So to improve that connectivity, policymakers have either set aside investments or put measures in place to support aviation. America's Essential Air Services Programme, which subsidises links to the national aviation system in over 170 communities, should be viewed in that context, along with the European Union's Public Service Obligation Programmes, the so-called PSOs. And indeed, you can find out more about these projects in the ITF report, Government Support Measures for Domestic Air Connectivity. Definitely worth the read. So that's the backdrop out of which many questions arise. For example, which policies are the most effective in supporting domestic air connectivity? And how should aviation stakeholders work together to use new technologies to improve efficiency, security, and the travel experience? Well, they are big questions which can only be answered with the help of some very big brains. And here they are. Let me introduce our panel. Adefunke Adeyemi is Regional Director for Africa at the International Air Transport Association. Mark Emi is Vice President in charge of Environment, Air Transport, Public Affairs and Subsidiaries Overview at Airbus. Sylvia Guerre is the Regional Director, European and North Atlantic Office at the International Civil Aviation Organization, a post she has held since February 2019, so congratulations. Alan Ellingson is State Secretary at the Norwegian Ministry of Transport and Communications, and Michael Keenan is Deputy Minister of Transport for Canada. So this session will begin with a brief introduction from the panellists, followed by additional questions. And the last 25 to 30 minutes of the session will be given over to you, the audience. So that will be your opportunity to question the panel further or indeed raise additional points. If you want to ask a question, then please raise your hand and a member of the ITF staff will bring you a microphone. Can I also ask you to give your name and that of the organisation or publication you represent? Also, please switch off your mobiles or place them on silent. One other point as well. This discussion is very important because it feeds into a round table which is happening later in the year. That is the round table on connectivity for small populations in remote communities. It is taking place in Ottawa, Canada on the 23rd and 24th of September, and it will be hosted by Transport Canada. So can we begin with the first of our briefings from Adefunke Adeyemi? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juliet. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. This picture on the screen is going to underscore most of our discussions on this panel today. It shows us the picture of global connectivity by air. And we'll talk about what this picture means and what the potential implications, possibilities, and challenges are. But before going there, I'd just like to state that there's no doubt that the world needs intermodal, integrated, sustainable, and innovative transport. And I really like the picture that you see all around you with all the different forms of transportation that are part of the backdrop for the ITF. So if we go back in time, we'll see how transportation has evolved. Human beings needed transportation to move themselves and their goods around to do different things, just even sustenance, livelihood, everything. But that evolution was very, very slow. It took about 150-something thousand years for humankind to really transport itself. And every time that happened, every time in the evolution of that journey, it was an innovation, a technological innovation that made it happen. But the single most important technological innovation, and of course I'm biased for saying this, is aviation. The reason is that it's the only form of transportation that can get us goods, people, and services around the world with speed, across borders, in less than 24 hours. There's no other form. Road is fundamental, it's important, rail even more so, but they can't do it. Aviation is what does that. So the reason that we're all here, this regional connectivity story, of course, starts with the whole ecosystem of transportation, and then dovetails into this leapfrogging industry of aviation that has really been able to transform the face of modern society, of how we interact with each other. In 2018, Forbes had a list of 14 goods that were most traded in the world. Out of those, I think about 7 were goods that were carried by air. So aviation is a real engine for economic development, for economic growth, for economic movement. Absolutely. But beyond the economics of it, how about the societal impact of aviation? We were having our side discussion earlier and talking about remote areas like in Norway. Well, how about Africa? There are places where even cars can't get to. So how do they eat? How do they get their medicines? It's the planes and the drones. They airdrop all of these essentials for people in these areas. So aviation is critical to modern society. The interesting thing about this picture, as you can see, is, I like to call it it's like the disco. So you can see the red lights over there, hot area, Latin America. You can see Europe. You can see Asia Pacific and Far East Asia. And then you can see Africa right in the middle. And this picture tells its own story. For starters, you can see that in terms of volume and density, there is a lot of connectivity between intra-regional, where all the lights are densest, as well as between the regions. So you can see thick lines between North America, Europe, Africa, Europe to Asia, etc. It tells its own story. And this is a very interesting story because aviation really does connect the world in that sense. The interesting thing about Africa, which is what I'm passionate about, and I've been doing this since I'm covering the region, but also the issue about air transport in Africa and what it can do for the continent, is that if we were to dream and have a single African market, what would that mean? Well, it would mean that out of the 1.2-something billion people in Africa, of which only 98 million travel by air, it would mean that if we were to connect all the 55 countries on the continent, then an exponential number of people could travel by air. And all of the underpinnings of what that means could happen too. So the movement to connecting people to goods to markets, connecting people, education, all of that, healthcare, all the wonderful things that aviation does that frees the world to do would be able to happen on the continent of Africa as well. And that's really important from a socio-economic point of view, but also from a regional integration point of view. As I round up my comments, I would just like to go now to the policy aspect of this dream. So the single African market is an idea to domesticate aviation across the continent of Africa, similar to what has happened in Europe already with the single European market. And we've seen what benefits that has brought to Europe as a continent and each of the countries within Europe. So that is a policy initiative of the African Union. It's supported by two complementary policy initiatives, one being the Continental Free Trade Area for Africa, and a free movement protocol, which means that there will be maybe an African passport and ease of entry for Africans. Did you know that for me to go to Morocco as an African, I need a visa? And so many other countries on the continent. But if we were to ease that, just as we have like the open area, Schengen, etc., then it would really make a difference. So from a policy point of view, it's really important that these three initiatives work. But the flagship of them is the SATAM, is the Single African Air Transport Market, because that is how that's the practical way that you can really regionalize the continent. We don't have robust alternatives in terms of road and rail that can traverse the entire continent. So this is our short to medium term solution. Now, in terms of affordability, that's an issue. It's an issue for Africa. The cost of air travel in Africa is notoriously expensive. And it's maybe one of the reasons why we have these low numbers that I mentioned to you. But the whole idea here is that with the policy underpinnings and the practical opening up of the skies across the continent, it will allow for the conditions of the market to become such that it will be cheaper for Africans to fly. It would be more affordable. There would be shorter travel times. There would be more competition in the market and all the wonderful things that come with that. So in short, these are fundamental issues. And of course, as we develop this, we look finally at the sustainability aspect as well. And it's great because we're in a growth stage. You can see our picture over there. We're not quite as dense yet. So if we're already mindful of it at this moment, then it will form part and parcel of the development of the industry, and we'll be able to carry that issue forward in the best way possible. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Adefunke. Let's move on now to Mark Ami. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My pleasure to be here too. Difficult to speak just after such a brilliant speech about the benefit of aviation. I could just say I fully agree. But yes, aviation is really about connecting people. More than 4 billion passengers a year, and the demand is still growing. Only last year, 260 million more passengers were traveling. And we can see in the future the perspective of a doubling traffic every 15 years. So the appetite for traveling by air is there and is still growing. If we look at Europe, interesting to see that in 2002, the traffic was about 400 million passengers, and it is now about 900 million passengers. And 2/3 of this traffic is within Europe, within cities in Europe, domestic or international traffic within Europe. So I think we can say that air transports are largely contributed to build a connected Europe. And now if we look at the future, interesting to see that the growth in traffic will be much more in the connection with the other regions of the world. So if air transport are largely contributed to build Europe, and I have to say this week that we need Europe and we need a strong Europe for the future, I have to say also that air transport is now contributing to the relationship between this unified Europe with the rest of the world, and especially with the developing regions, developing country, as of course in Asia, in the Middle East. And so it places Europe at the center of the game of the new development on this planet. Of course, with such a growth, we have to address the climate change issue and the environmental issue. If you look at the past, we have already achieved a lot of progresses. Since the beginning of the modern aviation, so the 60s, the fuel efficiencies, the CO2 emission of an aircraft for 100 kilometers per passenger has already been reduced by 80%. Now, all the states gathering in ICAO in Montreal, this international organization, so in fact the entire world has decided to implement in 2020 a scheme for reducing CO2 emission of aviation, CORSIA, to ensure carbon neutral growth of aviation in the future from 2020. But as an industry, we want to go a step further, and with the International Air Transport Association, IATA, with the airport, with the air navigation navigation services, and all the manufacturers in the world, we have committed to reduce the global emission, the total emission of aviation in 2050 by 50%. Of course, it's a huge challenge for us, especially a technological challenge. This probably means that the aircraft in which you'll be flying 20 years from now will be totally different. It will be a new experience for you. But to go to a better environment, of course, is now an essential part of our strategy. So aviation is not only part of the past, I do believe that it is an essential part of our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sylvia Guerra.
Can you hear me?
Can we adjust the microphone, please?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. And after Mark has already covered also CORSIA, so what to say? So what I would like to do is to share with you a personal story, because sometimes the concrete meaning of connectivity can be demonstrated in quite a personal experience. So I'd like to share with you something that happened a few years ago to me. I was on a business trip in Tbilisi, Georgia. And early in the morning, I got a call from home that my father had died. My flight from Vienna to Tbilisi took 3 hours, direct flight, no problem. So I thought it would be easy to go back, and there would be other routes as well, maybe with one connection. So there was no connection, no direct, no short one. So fortunately, I ended up the same day, very late in the evening, with a flight that our travel time that took 12 hours via Baku, Doha, and then back to Austria. I was very happy that I arrived back home, but during that time, minutes become ages, and it can create a big barrier between you and your family members. So as you talked about the social aspect, because we very often focus on the economic impact of connectivity, I'd like to share that to me, because that showed me what connectivity means. So now I'm in Paris. I'm heading the ICAO regional office since a few months. I'm in a privileged situation there because France is one of the best connected countries in the world with an airport accessibility that is one of the best in the world. So I'm easily going all over the world. So that's very good, but I'm covering, or the regional office is covering a very wide area, 56 states, Maghreb states, and also Iceland, but also some Central Asian states are accredited to the office, and it is the task of the office to assist these states in the implementation of the standards and policy that the International Civil Aviation Organization is developing. So what I see is that there is, of course, a big diversity, not only cultural, but from the viewpoint of development. There are some examples where connectivity is very poor. For example, in some of the area countries in the Central Asia or in the East, there are no connections between neighboring countries. You have not a connection between Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, for example, or between Azerbaijan and Kyrgyzstan. So in many areas, government stepped in to regions' government stepped in to support routes that would otherwise not be viable. And that is something that ICAO promotes and supports under certain conditions. So what is ICAO's role here? What can ICAO do as a specialized organization? First of all, there is an own branch in the International Aviation Organization, the Air Transport Bureau. A colleague is here, the Deputy Director, Toru Hasegawa, who has already introduced in a morning session a lot of figures on the development of connectivity. And what the organization is doing is to facilitate, in particular, regulatory the regulatory framework by developing templates and guidance material for air services agreement, because that's an essential issue that the framework is mature in order to allow airlines to build their network. The International Civil Aviation Organization is supporting government measures that ensure connectivity, and I can talk about that later. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Sylvia. You hear me? Great. The microphone is on, which takes us to Alan Ellingson. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Juliette. First of all, I enjoy being a part of this session. I'm pleased to be here. It's because in Norway we have a low population density and large distances and pretty challenging climatic and topographic conditions. That means that we are depending on air transport. To have people living along the coast, small villages and so on, we are depended on having this air transport. And in Norway there are 45 airports. And there are only 4 to 5 biggest airports that covers the deficit of the remaining airports. The problem in Norway, if it hasn't been for the aviation, is that people are living in very sparse population in the rural areas. That means that we are buying public service obligations and putting services on public tender to buy airport transportations throughout the whole country. There is no alternative. An example: in Norway are living people along the fjords and on the islands, and also in the north and in the east, in the west parts of the country. Also, the export-oriented economy are depending on these airports. An example to the larger hospitals, from some of these islands, it's 100 kilometers in line, 20 minutes with a plane. If you alternatively should drive, it will take about 6 hours and includes 2 ferries and so on. So that means if we should still be able to live like we do in Norway, and there's a lot of export from Norway. We export every day. Actually, we export 84 million fish meals to the world. And without the aviation, this could not be possible. So we are depending on air traffic. And this is also why the aviation plays a larger role in domestic transport pattern in Norway than in most of other European countries. And most of these airports actually have very short runways, 800 meters of runway. And it means that the fleet, which today traffic these runways, are becoming very old. The planes were introduced in 1983, and that means that their lifetime is becoming to an end very soon. And that gives us another opportunity, because the short distance regional airports, 10 kilometers, maybe you have 5 airports in a radius of 150 kilometers, means that we can be a test area for new sustainable low-emission solutions in aviation. And that is also why one of the companies who do traffic on these regional airports have said that within 2025 they will be able to make traffic on these airports with hybrid or zero-emission planes. That means that the cost will be lowered. Some say maybe we can, in Norway we have a lot of electrical energy, hydropower, the world's cleanest energy, and we export a lot of it. And that means that we have cheap energy, and electrical power is cheap, so we can cut the fuel costs and also the maintenance costs on electrical engines and so on. So it's very exciting what's happening in Norway the years to come. But aviation, we are depending on aviation to keep our society ongoing.
Thank you very much. And finally, Michael Keenan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juliet. I've worked out a deal in advance here with Ada Funke, and she's agreed that I can actually use her graphic. Is it possible to put her graphic
Can we bring back
up?
the graphic, please?
I'm doing this with full copyright and 15% of, I'm giving a 15% royalty of all my fees to Ada Funke for this.
Can we remove that message there?
Yeah, the graphic is there, something in the middle.
The entirety of the picture.
I would say I agree with all of my panelists. I know I'm not allowed to say that, but actually I thought there's a fundamental point that Ada Funke made starting out, is how important the jet age and the advances in aviation have been to modern life, you take it for granted. So I started doing sessions here about noon today. I was in my office in Canada until mid-afternoon yesterday, and I'm here, and then I picked up at noon today. There was an age when instead of having sort of an overnight and a bit in between the meetings in Europe and Canada, it would have had to have been, say, 2 months, right? Or even in the modern steamship era, it would have had to have been 6 weeks. And things you take for granted are built in. The improving regional connectivity, I think the first step is to continue to improve global connectivity. And the incredible reduction in cost and convenience and accessibility of global air transport is a trend that everybody thinks will continue, and it should continue, and it's a good thing. There are environmental issues. The carbon footprint is an enormous one, and it has to get better, and there's a lot of effort at that. You know, our colleague here from Airbus and the other manufacturers are finding a way to make the planes more energy efficient, fuel efficient. We're working on biojet. There will be electric planes at some point, and so the carbon emissions have to come down. But I think it would be a mistake to say we have to stop global aviation. I think it has to continue. I think one of the big challenges we're going to have is managing the scale and issues about just managing all these people across borders and through airports and coming up with a known digital traveler identity and things that be important. I'll give you that is good in and of itself, and it will improve and it will help regional connectivity. And the reason I've asked to borrow Adefunke's chart with full 15% royalties, although I think we can negotiate, right? And if you look, you had spoken about like the dark part in the heart of Africa there, and there's a ring of activity around it, and it's growing, and like Africa in aviation is growing like gangbusters, and there's probably some of the most exciting things. There's another part of this chart that's dark, you don't notice it, and it's above the red. So the big red dots are sort of northern U.S., southern Canada. Canada has some very busy global airports. We have aviation. Aviation is growing like gangbusters in Canada, and we're trying to manage the growth. But if you look above the red, there is millions and millions of square kilometers where there's very little. And some of those communities, like in Norway, there are communities that their only access is by air. And there's either for a good part of the year, there's no other way to move in and out of the community. And there was a long time ago, where people lived like that. They lived in communities where you couldn't leave for 6 months of the year. It doesn't work nowadays. Getting transportation services working that are economical, that are sustainable, that meet the needs of these communities is an enormous challenge. Interestingly enough, the developments in global aviation are helping. I'll give you one example, and I'll talk about two quick things and I'll stop. One of the big problems is we have short runways. We're very jealous of Norway. I just discovered all of the short, rural, remote runways in Norway are paved. In Canada, a lot of them are still gravel. They have very limited navigational aids. These are tiny communities where that airstrip is it is the lifeline. The only way to get medical help, the only way to get food for a good chunk of the year is through that airstrip. And there will be days upon days upon days where planes can't land because there isn't sufficient navigational aids in these tiny communities to land it. I don't think there's, at Frankfurt, at Heathrow, there's not a day in the year that planes can't land because they have very sophisticated systems. Well, the investments in global aviation have created satellite-based air navigation. So the world is moving to satellite-based air navigation. That is going to allow us, and we're working to help facilitate the rollout of precision navigation into remote airstrips that is possible only because billions have been invested in a satellite-based navigation system for global aviation. And all of those innovations will eventually find their way to the most remote airstrip. We have to do a better job. We have to build better connectivity, but we have to realize there's a symbiotic relationship between the most remote air connectivity and the biggest global hubs. The other thing that is of critical importance for our remote and regional air connectivity and is also a global challenge is the social inclusion of who flies the plane. One of our biggest problems, particularly in our most remote communities, is the airlines who serve them can't find pilots. There's a global shortage in pilots. It's at its worst in the most remote, smallest planes because they're the feeder groups. The big airlines and the big planes reach down into the regional carriers. So everybody's scrambling to find more pilots. The place where we need to look more is beyond is in the groups that have never been in the cockpit. Canada is doing pretty well in terms of gender inclusion in the broader labor market. About 40, it's almost half and half. The labor market participation of women is almost the same as men, not quite, but it's very close in Canada. In the cockpit and in the pilot seat, it's crazy. 7% of the pilots in Canada are women. So we're going out and in these northern communities, often the majority of them are Aboriginal. Only 3% of the pilots are Aboriginal. There is a social inclusion in terms of hiring and training and bringing other groups into the cockpit that, in our view, is central to the regional aviation story. And it's also central to solving the global aviation story because unless we can diversify in terms of who has the opportunity to train to be a pilot, we're not going to be able to fill the planes, whether they're going into a global hub or the tiniest isolated hamlet in northern Norway or northern Canada.
Okay, thank you very much. So you've all really laid out compellingly the strong case for aviation connectivity. But let me throw something into the mix, which I'd like you all to respond to as you see fit, because aviation connectivity is not a silver bullet. It can really stimulate structurally weak economies where there are no sectors with a comparative advantage. Isn't that the flip side to this? Who'd like to tackle that? Or shall I select one of you? Alan.
Well, yes, of course, because businesses are all around, and in the regions in Europe, you know, between the cities, maybe aviation is competing with high-speed railways and so on. But in the rural areas, there is not an alternative, and even Norway is not very central in Europe. So we have to have good flight connections, both from the rural areas, but also from the big cities. And there's no alternative. So to have growth in the economy, mobility is very important. People should live a happy life and visit their families, go to vacations, or businesses need to have meetings and get their products to the market. Of course, aviation is also a part of the growth and the economic growth in all over Norway. It is.
Okay then, and let's look at another side to this within the context of this discussion, because we know that for many carriers, it is the long-haul routes that are the more profitable than these short-haul domestic journeys, whilst capacity constraints at some national hubs have crowded out marginal, largely domestic routes. Another factor that you guys will have to take into consideration. I mean, Sylvia, you were nodding at that. Let's get your take on that.
No, for sure, that's an issue, or a big challenge that you have. These high profitable routes that are exchanged for routes that are not economically not viable. So talking about, I think you brought the example of what you do under the PSO regulation that can be applied by the countries of the European Economic Area. And if I'm not mistaken, this would also foresee the possibility to reserve slots for these PSO routes. So there are possibilities to reserve slots. and that might be a way to create the necessary capacity there as well.
So slot reservation, I know that you wanted to respond to that point as well.
I just wanted to add, just to add to the whole conversation. You know, generally speaking, every aviation route requires a lead time for you to reach break-even or profitability, whether it's domestic or it's international. Now, how most of the airlines have been able to cope and, and try to sustain themselves in the financial context of operating an airline business or airline businesses is to generate economies of scale and to build the right kinds of partnerships. Now, it's a fallacy that aviation is profitable. It's actually not. So in the past 40 years, there was a study done a few years ago, that in the past 40 years of commercial aviation, the total average profitability of the industry was 0.04%. I mean, it's ridiculous in a sense. It's like a charity. So we hear about Amazon, we hear about, Apple's, and these guys are posting record profits, every quarter. And well done to them. But the industry that we serve is a very high cost and very thin margin industry. And so it makes it very difficult to sustain profitability. And it was only in the past 5 years or so that we started to see that shareholders who invested in aviation started to see a return on their investments in aviation. And we see the concentration of profitability, if we can call it that, in North America primarily, and that's a result of some of the consolidation, the movements that have happened in the market. And so going back to the point about building economies of scale, critical mass, and then the right kind of partnerships just to help you cope with the sheer number of issues that you have to deal with within the ecosystem of an airline. Everybody else, sort of makes money except the airline itself. Mm-hmm. So it's these are some of the ways that the industry has built resilience to resist many of these shocks. And the shocks are not just the structural shocks in terms of how the industry is the way it's formed or it's structured. It's also external. Anything can affect the industry. A policy change today can affect the industry. We're talking about Brexit now. Look at what the potential implications of Brexit could be. We're looking at trade wars. We're looking at protectionist tendencies. All of these can affect. Volcanic ash, if you remember that, it affected the industry so profoundly. Like no one even anticipated that was a thing. So these are some of the issues that the industry faces on a day-to-day basis. We build the resilience to deal with sustainability, sustaining ourselves. So the sustainability question isn't just about the environment, which is very important, of course, and we're doing a lot about that. But it's also how to sustain the industry itself.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, because we were having a conversation on the side of this, because and we managed to work the environment into this, and you addressed the point with a very powerful example, Michael, and this is about the idea that there are, the choice perhaps, according to your political optics, that you may have to make about connecting communities. If they're so removed, why not just bring them in? Doesn't that make life a bit easier? It's displacing people, yes, but then having said that, there are some areas which, because of their topography, may be prone to flooding. You have to make a choice. Do you keep on building flood defences which will be breached, or do you just say, no, enough, let's just move people in closer?
That is an extremely difficult question, and it's an extremely difficult thing to do. It's interesting that I think all of us, every country, is facing issues about moving people because of they're discovering vulnerabilities of community to climate impacts. And in Canada, we have the misfortune, we have a flood season when the snow melts, and the flood seasons are getting worse and worse. And we have a forest fire season in the summer when the forests dry out, and that's getting worse and worse. And we're actually at a crossover point now where historic flooding has not yet eased, and the really terrible forest fires have started. So we're living. There's a lot of communities in Canada, and there's many other countries where all of a sudden the people are discovering their communities in an inhospitable place. Coming up with an easy solution to move neighborhoods or to move communities because they're in an inhospitable place is extremely difficult, and we in our country have a sad history of having done that a few times to indigenous communities, and it was terrible. So it is extremely fraught issue. I think a better approach is how do you build climate resilience, and what are the changes you have to make in your community, and maybe the community will move. Or some of the community will move, but if you impose it on a community from the outside, it would be an unmitigated disaster. I'm just going to I've got the mic, I'm going to pick up. I must say, I think my take on airline profitability is about right. I think you'd have to have your head examined if you want to sort of put all your life savings in airlines. But if your perspective is, and as an investor in the airline, then that's a terrible thing. If your perspective is getting transportation solutions for citizens, I'm not sure that's a bad thing. In the sense,
but that's almost like altruistic investing, and surely that's changing the whole approach to investing if you're doing it for the good of bringing communities together. The sector keeps expanding. The brutal competition keeps improving choice and driving down prices, and if not in absolute terms, in relative terms. The more problematic one from a perspective is the industries like the Googles and the Apples and the Facebooks who have enormous profits, as you say, and they're doing it because they have barriers to competition. They're able to the platforms give them barriers to competition. And we as consumers are giving them our data for free. That's a much worse deal than as consumers of airlines where maybe the tickets are underpriced a bit, but there's a democratization of travel that I think it is a good thing. And our experience in Canada has been that we're trying to encourage and get more competition and more players, which works both for the big hubs and the small communities. Players come and go, and they go bankrupt, and it is a tough business model to run an airline into a small remote communities. But through the ups and downs over the decades, there is more accessible service to those communities than there was before through competition. Compared to the old days when the government regulated the monopolies, they actually had higher prices and less services. So it's if there's any airlines in the crowd, they won't be popular with this thing. But I'm not sure it's a bad thing. They're not making that much money. Okay, and fascinating as well, Alan. You talked about the quality of life aspect in terms of bringing communities together, but there's more to it than that, because you gave the example of the fish. So for you, that connectivity is part of your economic supply chain.
Yes, it is, and we spend about 100 million euros a year buying services from 30 of our airports, and they feed into the larger hubs, which are very commercial. Plane business is taking them further on to the larger cities or to Europe, and for us, it's we have a lot of fisheries, both wild catched and farmed salmon. I think we are the world's largest producer of farmed salmon, and the market is far away. It's Asia, it's France, and other places in Europe. And if we couldn't get our goods out to the world, it's a contributor to our economy. And in addition to that, if we use 100 million euros a year to buy this public obligation, the aviation is a netto contributor to the Norwegian economy, isolated, because they pay a lot of fees and taxes. So that means that if you discount the 100 million euros, they are a netto contributor. And of course, mobility is very important, and why we cannot catch the fish other places than where the fish is. and it have to be brought fresh to the market. And the people who are selling fish need to come to do business, visiting their business partners all around the world. And that's why aviation is so important. And as I said, air ambulances in some places of Norway came this winter 60, 70 centimeters of snow in just a few hours. All the roads were closed, bridges, they were stormy, but the planes, they worked. They were in traffic when all other transportation systems were shut down. So for us, it's both security, but also making people live their lives where they want to do. And there's no Norwegian political party even thinking about moving people to more urban areas. There's an urbanization going on in Norway as well, but it's not with political wish to move people. People will live where they want to live their life, and we will have an infrastructure that makes them be able to do that.
Okay, which leads me quite nicely to you, Mark, because, okay, we know about the importance of connectivity, the challenges which it brings to the carriers. You've got to develop the technology on this. So where do you start, and what timeline can you reasonably impose, given that there are other challenges coming through, environmental challenges, expectations of generations of current and future travellers, etc., in these communities?
Well, so the technology is moving fast, but that's true that we are a long cycle industry because, of course, the process is integrated a lot of issues, and safety is one, and the use of new technology have to be certified, tested, and so on. But we can see in the recent history an acceleration of the movement coming from the competition, which is pushing everyone to have a better aircraft, more efficiency, and so on. We are testing new technology. We have just signed an agreement with SAS to look at hybrid or electrical aircraft. We'll see, and we are associating the airports because it's important, of course, to have the infrastructure on the ground to work on that. And we are also looking, as you probably know, to new ways of flying, what we call urban air mobility. It's not long-distance flight. It's short-distance flight, but the technology is there. And it will be electrical vehicles, so silence and not emitting any emission. It will help us to learn about the electrification of aircraft, and we can see it can bring more connectivity on short distance. Could be from one airport to the city, something like that, and it will probably be a good platform to extend it to other vehicles in the future with a longer range. And we can see also, of course, new urbanization models, what we call the smart cities, that already integrated this new mobility, new connectivity in their plan. And so we think that there is a future for this. Airbus is engaged in that.
Okay. I mean, before we open things out to the audience, one of the things I do want to look at in the time that we have available is the idea of subsidising. I want to put this to you, Sylvia, because if you subsidise routes, isn't there the risk of pushing up the price on domestic destinations, particularly for these remote communities, especially if a carrier uses those subsidies to establish a monopoly and raise ticket prices?
I would look to to some examples that are out, like the Norwegian example. I would say there are strong criteria under which these routes can be served. So there is a case that and criteria that have to be followed under the PSO system. And Of course, it has to be proven that these routes that are supported by government funds or by also local community funds do not distort competition. So there are a number of steps, criteria, methodology involved in the whole process. So it's not an easy issue to set up an essential service route, and I remember that back when I was in the Austrian administration, that we tried once to get a connection between Vienna and Bolzano in Italy, because it's very complicated to go there otherwise, and the biggest problem was who would pay for that, who would support that. I think that's really the challenge with the support. There has to be a government plan behind. There has to be a strategy. It has to be in your national aviation plan. You have to be aware of your connectivity ranking. You need to know what you want for your society. So that's certainly a big issue.
Okay. Can we now throw this open really to the floor? Is there anybody, gentleman over here, could you please bring a microphone to him, and if you could introduce yourself and the organisation that you represent. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. It works? Yeah. Good evening. My name is Philippe Villard. I'm the head of Economic and Capacity Policy at Airports Council International, ACI. We are the representative organisation of the world's airports. So my take on the discussion is that regional connectivity and connectivity to a remote area is crucial, and that one of the challenges is how we make it doable or profitable for the carriers. I would like to challenge this thinking, because it assumes that there will always be an airport at the end of the route. What we know is small airports are inherently unprofitable and loss-making. We calculate at ACI that the threshold is more or less 1 million pax per year. So if you're below 1 million passengers, it's very difficult to make a profit. So Canada or Norway are wealthy states, but Funke in your region is much more challenging, because we have quite a number of countries where even the largest airport doesn't reach the 1 million threshold. And my point here for the panel members is, how do we integrate airports into the equation, because they cannot be left aside of this discussion, and assuming that there will always be an airport at the end of the route is probably a shortcoming. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to tackle that first?
So, Philip, I'm going to tell the crowd that you used to work in IATA. Is that okay? He did.
Your cover has been blown.
So, yes. So this is a conundrum. The airlines and the airports have this ongoing debate. And to his point about not leaving the airports out, he's absolutely right. In order for us to ensure regional connectivity and sustained regional connectivity, the underpinnings must be there. The Director General of IATA said in the opening plenary not long ago that one of the critical elements to sustaining air transportation is the infrastructure that underpins it. Now, I want to challenge also the idea that it has to be an airport in the conventional sense. So there's the possibility of having, small, functional, scalable, modular airports. An airport is simply a place where people come to get into a plane and fly. It doesn't have to be the big, shiny models. In Africa, we're seeing a lot of this coming up these days. There's a particular airport in a country, I wouldn't name it. The capacity is 15 million passengers. And this country, I don't think in its history has even seen a total of up to 1 or 2 million. And so you just wonder, some of the politics behind it, of course, that's one thing in terms of, what drives these kinds of infrastructure development. But it's also, what is needed, what is necessary, and what can be done? How can we change the models? We're trying to change the model. Technology is driving change in the business model of the airlines itself. The airports as well, that kind of revolution needs to happen in terms of how we use or utilize the infrastructure, what kind of infrastructure we use. And I'm sure, I'm not just speaking for Africa, of course, this would be useful in Canada, in Norway, and even Europe, in anywhere. These are the kinds of conversations that need to start to happen in terms of the innovations around the airport infrastructure.
Okay, would anyone else like to address that point? Seems not. I think you've spoken on behalf. Excellent, Michael.
I just want to pick up. I agree with that completely, and that it is absolutely true that some threshold and your number sounds reasonable. Below that, the economics of the airport are tough, and above that, they get increasingly positive to the point where they're not a G7 economy, but they're bigger. Some airports are bigger than some economies in the world, right? But in Canada, we used to have a lot of small airports that the national government ran, and we ran them very efficiently and very inexpensively, and we tried to do a one-size-fits-all, and it didn't work. And I think that there is a role for government in some core infrastructure, particularly around safety and making sure and help and providing some financial support to ensure that the core safe infrastructure is there. But I think you want to leave it wide open, and there's I think a lot of exciting you avoid building these Taj Mahals. And there's a lot of exciting models, and the market, the local community, and the rapidly evolving market for air travel will sort it out, and there will always be an airport there. It may not look like your grandparents' airport, but there will always be an airport there, and the safety regulators will ensure that it's safe. And then after that, just let it evolve. And I think a national program we found our airports much more successful once we got them away from government and they could operate as local entities, and you don't want to ever reverse that trend. It would just put it backwards.
Okay, would anybody else like to add some more details to that, or should we take another question? No? Okay, let's take another question. Gentleman over here, could you introduce yourself, please, and the name of the organisation or publication you represent?
Okay, thank you. Good evening. My name is Givandi, and I'm a master student from Sapienza University of Rome. And I would like to ask the speakers about some questions about connectivity. I believe that connectivity is not always about the infrastructures of the airports and connecting the airports and the flights, but I believe it's all about how people can afford to fly or to go to anywhere, or the people who want to send goods to everywhere in the world. So my point is, how is the connectivity with the regions or an area where people cannot afford that kind of service? Thank you.
Right, so connecting people who can't actually afford the cost. Alan?
Well, in Norway, we as I told, we put this on public tenders and subsidizing these routes from 30 regional airports. And there's a lot of criteria, of course, but one of the criteria is a maximum ticket price. So that means that the company who are winning the contract will not be able to price the tickets higher on these routes than the government has put the criteria. And that means that a kind of equal possibility to use planes as a way of getting where you are supposed to get. So that is how we solve this in Norway. If this should be commercialized, I think two things will happen. Firstly, low price. Volume means business. That means that the lower prices makes more passengers. and more business for the companies. And if we didn't, there will be less passengers and less people to pay for this activity.
Okay, would anybody else like to answer that question? Mark.
We have addressed the issue of competitivity. Obviously, there is a competition between the manufacturers, but there is a competition between the different modes of transport. And it's amazing to see some prices in air transport now. When I said that 4 billion people are traveling, this is also because it becomes affordable for many, many populations in the world. And the growth is coming from this. Close to half of the worldwide population has now access to air transport, and this figure is growing year after year. First, it's becoming because what we call the middle class is growing in many areas in the world, and so they can get access. But at the same time, the price for a ticket is decreasing because the performance coming from the competition and the new technology is reducing the price. And so we can see that affordability is growing, more and more people are traveling, and this is a virtuous cycle that allows now to air transport to be really a mass transport. And when young people, so with a little budget, are looking to what is the best way of traveling, sometimes they can choose the train, the road, but quite often now they just choose air transport because this is the lowest price offered to them. Okay.
Is there anybody else who'd like to ask a question? Holding off for the moment. Okay. Let me pick up again on the point of PSOs. I'd like to get your response, Alan, but also just to throw it open to other panel members as well, because it is driven by a tendering process. And there is the argument of some academics that when a lot of these operators get the contract, everything is fine, but there tends to be a drop-off in the quality of service. And then it becomes consistent when it comes up for tender again. Is that a viable observation? I have to stress it's not my observation. This is what those who've actually looked at the PSO process have brought out.
Yeah, I think everyone who has experienced a monopoly knows that the service is not that good. But I think in the aviation industry, service is very important. People expect having good service when they are good service when they are taking a plane. So I don't think that we see that in Norway, and there are the public tenders. There is 2 or 3 companies who are getting these public tenders, so they are also competing. Yeah, they are. So I don't think this is a problem in the aviation industry. I think it's a bigger problem in other segment of the transport.
But it does exist in some way, shape or form.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. The other point as well, and again, I want to throw this out to everybody, is that PSOs are great, but sometimes the targeting is a bit questionable. Yes, it goes to remote areas, but then there are also areas which perhaps don't fall within the classic definition of remote. They get lots of tourists anyway, and they're getting a hell of a few more tourists as a result of those PSO deals. So doesn't that sort of undermine the concept behind them if it's slightly misdirected, or that's the perception that it may be a bit misdirected? Who'd like to take that? Nobody.
Well, the tourist industry makes workplaces and income to the remote places. So if this PSOs means that even more people are traveling to the remote places, I think that's only positive. So and we see that the traffic numbers in Norway are increasing, and what makes them become higher, the volume, is that there are a lot of foreigners visiting Norway. And Norway has a rich and beautiful nature. That means that this is a part of our strategy to make business out of tourism. So for the government, this is something we actually want to happen.
Let me broaden things up by looking at the stakeholders, because yes, we're talking about the airports, the carriers, the communities themselves, but how much involvement should communities have in air connectivity schemes? Because when we talk about PSOs, for example, it does seem remote from the beneficiaries, but is there a sense, I mean, our moves underway, you guys can inform me, because this is your world, not mine, but how do you get local communities involved in things which ultimately they are supposed to benefit from?
Okay, so this is a very important point you've raised. The idea that aviation as an industry, we congregate, we collaborate, and we talk a lot amongst ourselves. I'm not sure how effectively we have communicated the value that aviation brings to those communities to the communities. And that's something that, you know, we're talking about internally within IATA about how to do this better, more efficiently. And one idea that we're exploring is really trying to map aviation's impact on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Every country in the world has signed up to a target of 2030 with the UN on, you know, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the countries take them seriously, right? It's something that they're putting time and resources behind. And so maybe this is a way to start to have a conversation that's wider than our universe. Because so far, we're speaking, we have rings, yes, we have rings, but it's still, you know, within transport, aviation, and, you know, the ecosystem, stakeholders, partners, etc. But there needs to be a way that we take this conversation further out. And I think this same point speaks to what's happening with the environment, particularly in Europe. We've heard about the Greta effect, what's happening, the new word in the Swedish dictionary of fly shaming, and all of this stuff, that how aviation is now seen to be a target, as my CEO said earlier. But if the world were to understand what aviation is doing, the fact that, one, it is the only industry in the world that voluntarily decided to do something about its aviation emissions without prompting, decided to do that. And we set 3 targets, and those targets were underscored with 4 pillars. Target 1 was that we would improve our fuel efficiency by 1.5% up until, you know, a particular period of time. We've already surpassed that target. We're at 2.7%. Target 2 was that we would cap our carbon emissions by 2020. And this is what we're starting to do now with the CORSIA scheme that Mark mentioned to you under the ICAO umbrella. And target 3 is that by 2050, we would have today's emissions. And this is with the anticipation that we're still going to continue to grow as an industry. So there's a lot happening. But if we're only talking amongst ourselves, then the world doesn't know that. So it's important for us to be better with our advocacy, really change the conversation, the target of our conversation, make it more B2C rather than, you know, more business to business as it has been. And I think that way we can, you know, kill those birds.
Thank you very much. Thanks also for coming back to the environment and what has been mentioned by Mark at the beginning, talking about CORSIA and the so-called historic agreement in 2016 to agree on an offset system to reduce CO2 emissions, which was really an agreement that was negotiated for more than 10 years. So. So in aviation, a lot happens to reduce the negative effects, but that is somehow not known, not communicated well. So I think that this communication is something we all have to do. It's not only ICAO's tasks, it's all stakeholders that have to do that campaign and show what aviation is doing in order to reduce CO2 emissions. Because when you in particular look at some of the European states, a lot of tax discussion comes up again. Some countries have introduced tax, ticket tax, and other countries think about it or plan it. This is a bad move for the International Civil Aviation Organization that is now, we're now over, I think it's more than 70 states that have committed to go along with CORSIA, and those are, and I think they would be covering 80% of the CO2 emissions. So it's an important step, and if that needs to be a success, and that's why we all have to do something.
Okay. Michael, did you want to add to that at all?
Building on that, it has been an experience in Canada that in terms of getting and solving the really difficult challenge of the regional air link to a particularly remote and small community, often if the people who are running the service are completely disconnected from the community, it doesn't go as well as if they're connected. And there's a lot of communities now that are running the airports, and you would call them more short airstrips with a shed than an airport, but it works, and they're doing a good job running it. And we've seen increasingly over the years companies develop, because aviation is a scale business, but there is a certain scale that seems to work in terms of regional linkages. And a number of them are community-owned, a number of them going into northern Aboriginal communities are Aboriginal-owned, and they work. They actually have roots in the community. They don't make money, but they find a way to run the business so it breaks even, and it provides a service, and they're motivated to do it not to make money. They're motivated to do it because they're connected to the community. And so it does seem to be a formula that works. On the targeting subsidies, there's always, any attempt to target a subsidy always has intended and unintended consequences, and it's the work of generations to try and figure out how to do this. One possible way, and one thing that's often done in Canada, is you're targeting the subsidy on the purpose of the travel. So if it's required, and in very remote communities, people often have to travel for medical care. And the medical care may be free, but the transportation cost will bankrupt the family. And so having resources, so if you're traveling for medical care out of necessity, that there's a role for the government in subsidizing that heavily to the point of sometimes often making it free, is one way to target subsidies.
Are there any further questions from the audience? Would anybody like to put a question to our panel? Is anybody who'd like to put a question to the panel? No, still shy? Shall I select somebody? Don't tempt me, the gentleman in the light blue shirt. Would you like to put a question to the panel? Or would you like to raise an observation? Sure. Could you pass the gentleman the microphone, please? And if you could introduce yourself and the organisation you represent. Thank you.
My name's Robert Fennelly. I'm from the Southern Regional Assembly in Ireland. But I just thought your comments on the the green agenda and the targets you have, I thought that was very interesting. Like, we've gone through a recent consultation phase where we have 2 international airports and 2 regional airports in our region, and we're supporting them for economic growth as engines for our regional economy. And like, we drew some criticism in our public consultation on that's at odds with our goal for a carbon a carbon neutral society. You can't have growth in the aviation industry and achieve the goal of carbon neutral society. And I thought your information on that and what you set out was just very good information. And as you said, it's not widely known. It would be good for us to integrate this narrative in support of the aviation industry in our policy making. So I think they're very interesting points, and yeah, we'll certainly be following up to investigate that and, you know, spread the word, if you like. Yeah.
You've got a thumbs up then. Would you like to respond to that? Would anybody else like to put a question or raise a point? The gentleman here, please, if you could introduce yourself, please, and the organisation you represent.
I am Tae from University of British Columbia, Canada, and also I represent the World Conference on Transport Research Society. Questions are open to all panelists. How many countries? I know that European Union has the PSO, Canada has the essential services, United States essential services, remote community services, and Africa has some sort of subsidy programs as well. How many of you actually use the competitive bidding for the remote community services? All of you use them, competitive bidding for the services, and setting the standards, quality standards, means frequency of services and the probably size of the aircraft and so on. You set the standards, quality standards, and then can you not use competitive bidding for remote community services? I know that United States Essential Services Program is not overly burdensome. There actually, the United States case that their subsidy levels came down overall. So what is the experience in Norway and European Union, Africa, and Canada? That's what I'd like to know. Why competitive bidding of the services that cannot work?
Okay, should we start with Canada and then work our way around the globe?
I think that the short answer is for why competitive bidding for the services is that it's a great way of getting the price down. It's that simple. I think as a number of these things have gone out to bid, I think the experience of different regional governments in Canada is that the price of providing the essential service has come down, which is a good thing because you can provide more essential service for whatever amount of funding you have.
In Africa, traditionally, many governments have supported their national airlines, right? And so, in a way, they've provided, financial support even when some of those airlines were not doing so well. It's only in recent times, I think just about a year ago, under the umbrella of the African Union, that the African governments are coming up with the idea of having essential services supported by the government. So let's say we are playing catch-up. It wasn't something that we started out with, but we're now introducing, as a continent, introducing that into the grand scheme of transportation, of air transport. So that will follow a process, and I'm sure that, the competitive bidding idea will probably be a part of that, but I haven't actually experienced it.
I think you mentioned the PSO, that's the one I know in the European Union, European Economic Area, so there is competitive bidding foreseen.
Yeah, the same as in Canada. The competition makes the prices lower. That is why we are having these public tenders. Also because of the EU regulations, of course, but competition makes prices lower, and that means that we have to have a criteria that is good enough for the quality and for the frequency and everything, but we cannot favorize some companies, so we have the real competition to lower the prices. So we have to form the criteria to make the competition works. And in Norway, we do lower the prices with these public tenders. Okay, is there anybody else who would like to ask a question?
No? I'd like to put one final question, in fact, to you, Mark. We talked about the pressures, pricing pressures, etc., which the aviation industry faces when it's working with remote communities, and the challenges going forward, particularly when we're trying to connect a continent, which is what Adefunke is trying to do. But looking ahead, how will aircraft manufacturers contribute to the sustainable development of air transport in the future to perhaps make us even more connected and to reach out to some of those areas which was on the graphic, the as yet very remote areas which have yet to experience that full explosion of connectivity?
Well, I think that you can find an aircraft to go everywhere. And the number of aircraft, you spoken of very short runway. We have aircraft with extraordinary performance to landing and takeoff on a very short runway. You have a range of capacity which is really very large, from very little aircraft to big aircraft. And of course, the operators can adapt the aircraft to the operational constraints, to the need, to the infrastructure, and so on. And so this is really an industry which basically is a flexible one and is ready to address the services needed for the population everywhere in the world. And so to get access to air transport to everybody. There could be, in some situation, a question of profitability, because this is really to serve a dedicated population which is far away from the other ways of transport, and that is a dedicated services. But anyway, if you ask, you will find a solution. And when I explain the trend, the evolution of the performance of the aircraft, and I think it's not the end of the story. This industry has developed a tool due to the competition, due to the evolution of the technology. Just an example, now a lot of aircraft are carbon made, which means that they are lighter. And so they fuel less burn. And so they are more economic. And so on. So I think that air transport is really a mode of transport that can distribute services in one day or less than one day from one point of the planet to the other, and now with direct flights, because the range of the aircraft is also close to half the planet, and so with one flight you can go everywhere. And at the opposite, with little aircraft, agile aircraft, that will be able to go everywhere, and perhaps tomorrow within the city. And so this flexibility, this adaptation, the competition, and the fight to reduce cost, to give accessibility to everybody is there. Of course, the role of the politics, first to build the infrastructure, to organize the services according to the population is still there. So I think the industry is making everything possible to offer competitive air transport, but sometimes, yes, we need, and we're happy to be with you. And I think it's from the beginning of the history of aviation, there is a good cooperation between the different stakeholders. We are grouped in ATAG, with the air navigation services, with the airport, with the airlines and with the manufacturers, but also very often we work with the institution. They are certifying our aircraft, they are designing the global air transport network, they are defining the policies, they are setting up the rules, and so on. So, and ICAO is a body, is a state body. But working so close to the industry. And it's a machine to build consensus. And everybody is aligned and go on. And of course, we don't forget safety, which is one of the main responsibility to ensure the safety of people everywhere. Whatever is the type of aircraft, they are under the same rule for safety. And this is also a big achievement, I think, of this air transport sector, to be able to provide all these services safely and more at affordable cost.
Okay, thank you very much. A sound note on which to end this. I'd like to thank the panel for their time. Michael Keenan, Adefunke Adeyemi, Sylvia Guerra, Alan Ellingson, and Mark Emmy. Thank you so much. And one final point before you all depart. Remember that at the beginning I did say that this roundtable feeds into an even bigger event later in the year. That's the roundtable on connectivity for small populations in remote communities, one to put into the diary. It is taking place on the 23rd and 24th of September in Ottawa, Canada, and it is hosted by Transport Canada. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.